So today you find me at the wheel of a Mercedes SLK. Now, the eagle-eyed regular viewers among you may think, well hang on Mark, haven't you already reviewed a Mercedes SLK before? Well, you'd be right, I have reviewed an SLK before, but that was a first generation R170 SLK. Now that car was the 200 Kompressor model with about 160 horsepower. The car that I'm actually driving today is a second generation R171, and this particular one is the 350 with a 3.5 litre V6. Now when the first generation of this car launched in the late 1990s, it was something of a sensation, as it was one of the first sort of mass-produced cars on sale to have its Vario fold metal convertible roof. So the R171 is that difficult second album for Mercedes. Was the SLK going to be a one-hit wonder, or could it live on to be something more? Now the exterior styling of the original was very Germanic and very understated. With this second generation R171, the styling is much softer, much more rounded than on those earlier cars. But I think the biggest styling difference on the outside of this car is that nose. So by this point we'd already seen the McLaren Mercedes SLR hypercar with its F1 inspired nose. And yep, you guessed it, this car got something very similar. So in a sense, almost giving it a look of a shrunken SLR. Now, much like the original, the interior of this car is quite a nice place to be. Albeit quite compact, this is actually still quite a small car. Now the 170 that I drove was actually a really nice example of one, but they are generally quite prone to having the materials on the dashboard flake off. You can actually buy special paint from Mercedes to repair that, but many of them do look very tired. Thankfully no such issues in this car. The only thing that I would say looks a little tired is around this infotainment system. Now this material on here is something that a lot of manufacturers were using in the early 2000s. It's sort of a rubberized trim finisher, and they do end up looking scratched, and quite often they can end up looking very sticky as well. The plastics in here generally do feel quite solid. Obviously there's a lot of silver painted plastic because again, early 2000s, and that's just something that was appearing in a lot of cars. We had a lot of black plastic with a lot of silver accents everywhere. Now at the time this car was released, Mercedes were going through a bit of a rough patch, and quality was often criticised on the cars. That said, everything in here I think does feel quite solid. Yep, there are some hard plastics scattered around the car, but in general everything does feel quite solid. I'm quite surprised to find that this doesn't have a cup holder. I think some were available with a cup holder here, which would make the car quite a bit more usable. Okay, you've got a bit of storage in the centre armrest, and this particular car does also have a CD changer mounted in the glove box there. So the performance of the 200 compressor that I drove, I would have described as being perfectly adequate. Car had just enough punch, although it did sometimes like to change down a gear. This 350 obviously has quite a bit more torque than the 4-cylinder cars. The 3.5 litre V6 power in this car has around 268 horsepower and 350 newton meters of torque. Most of that torque is also in the mid-range, so it does feel quite punchy. We've got a 7-speed G-tronic gearbox in this car as well, the first of its kind. Initial impressions of it are actually pretty favourable as well. You can have the car in comfort or sport mode. At the moment I am in sport mode, and I'd say it's quite responsive, kicking down relatively early. You can also use a manual mode, which again in many automatics I've found can often be pretty dreadful, but in here it's not bad, it's reasonably responsive, and it does seem to allow you to actually do what you want it to do. Suspension wise, this car is kept in check with a multi-link front and rear suspension system. The big change here is the steering, because gone is the old recirculating ball system Mercedes used to favour, and now we've actually got a rack and pinion steering. Admittedly, the recirculating ball in the old car wasn't as horrific as it might sound. In fact, I thought the steering was quite good. But yep, this one does steer rather nicely. I also like that we've got a relatively thin rimmed steering wheel as well, something we don't always see on modern sports cars or even any cars today. The buttons for some of these controls on the steering wheel actually do remind me quite a bit of some Mercedes trucks from the same era that I've driven. As you might expect with the following generation, this car did get an extra 30mm or so in the wheelbase. We also got a bit more length, width and height, and consequently the car is marginally heavier as well. But even with this V6 engine, the car is still well under 1500 kilos, which I don't think is bad. The real big change to this car over its predecessor though is torsional rigidity. When the roof is down, it is claimed that this car is actually over 40% stiffer than its predecessor. Now certainly coming through some of the quicker bends, yeah, I'd say this car does feel quite stiff, and even on these slower speeds going over potholes and speed bumps, I've not really noticed much in the way of scuttle shake either. So should you buy an R171 SLK? Well, yeah, why not? In fact, I could recommend the R170 as well. But again, as I mentioned, don't be thinking it's an all-out sports car. It's quite practical as well. Mercedes claim sort of mid-20s fuel economy, rising to sort of high 20s on a longer run. Now the owner of this car actually on a longer run did actually achieve mid-30s, so I think that's quite respectable for an engine of this size. Another thing that makes this car a little bit more usable than its predecessor is you've actually got an extra 65 litres of luggage capacity back there. That's possible due to a redesign of this roof system. It's now got an extra pivot in there, which just allows it to squash up a little bit tidier and gives you a little bit more space in the back. This car certainly isn't an out-and-out sports car. Even on these optional 18-inch wheels, this car actually rides way better than many a regular car that I've driven of late, certainly the modern stuff. And this particular vehicle, even though it's the 3.5 litre V6, apparently the standard fit wheels on these were actually just 16-inch, so that I would expect will ride exceedingly well. Something else nice about this car is this is fitted with an optional air scarf, which was a £350 option, but you've got little vents built into the headrest here, and you've got a switch on the dash with 3 settings, so you can have nice warm air cosset in the back of your neck, which is quite nice on a rather windy day like today. The 350 is a nice sounding car, but a neighbour of mine actually looked at a 350 and ended up going for the 200 purely because it was a cheaper car to tax. Now they do use that car as a daily, and they do seem to like it, so certainly don't be put off by the less powerful models. I'm sure it's still quite an enjoyable car to cruise around in. Certainly if it's the kind of car you've always promised yourself, and you're really not wanting a race car, you just want something to cruise around in, it'll be more than adequate. Because if you feel that this 350 isn't enough for you, which to be honest it really is, you don't need any more than this. There was a AMG SLK 55. That one's got a V8 engine of over 5 litres, I believe, in that. You really don't need it, and to be brutally honest, when those cars were new, they was quite expensive, where I think the standard cars were sort of 30 odd thousand pound. You were jumping all the way up to over £50,000 if you wanted the AMG 55. Personally, I really wouldn't bother unless you really, really want one. I think these make a great used buy. One thing I have noticed is that at the moment these cars are still quite underappreciated. You can buy a tatty 100,000 mile R170 from as little as £1,000. £2,000 to £3,000 will probably get you something a bit better, or get you into a 171. Really though, if you can afford it, I would be looking probably around £5,000 should get you quite a nice car that hopefully won't need too much doing to it. If you do want to buy a cheaper one though, and spend the money, then by all means. That's what Jonathan, who owned the 170 I previously reviewed, did. And as I say, he's put a lot of work into it, and he's ended up with a really, really nice car at the end of it. Now, as always, I would like to thank you for watching, and I'd also like to say a big thank you to Davyd, who's loaned me this car today. Now, Davyd has his own YouTube channel, Davy Down the Road. Now, it's quite a young channel in its infancy. He's done the odd show report, but I know he's been focusing a lot on sort of driving road type videos, and some of the footage that he's shown me that he's been doing, some of his practice footage, does look quite impressive. So I think that's going to come on in leaps and bounds, and there should be some good videos to come. I dare say he's also probably going to feature this car quite heavily as well, with his own reviews and probably an ongoing vlog about his experiences of this car. So again, thank you very much for watching. As always, you know, continue to like, subscribe, comment, the usual stuff. In the meantime, if anybody has got a BMW Z3, maybe a Porsche Boxster, doesn't have to be an S or anything like that, it can be anything really. I think it'd make a great comparison to these SLKs. There were cars that was always compared at the time, so again, if you've got one of those, particularly if you're in the Yorkshire area, drop me a message. There will be a link in the video description.